There seems to be this accepted wisdom that documentary films are, for lack of a more nuanced term, boring. I say wisdom with air and literal quotations because that frame of mind is, for even greater lack of a nuanced term, stupid. There is so much power and insight to be gleaned from a solid documentary, and in this, the age of the Netflix docuseries, where the same people who wouldn't approach a 2-hour documentary with a 10-foot pole would gladly sit through 10 hours of documenting tiger kings or, I don't know, chopping up cats or something, it seems like the old wisdom is starting to fade away into the obscurity that it deserves. And yet, documentary films usually don't get any kind of wider theatrical release, and 9 times out of 10, when I do see one in a theater, I'm the only person there. So I ask, like every great philosopher,
why?
Why are people still treating documentary films like a filler category at the Oscars when there's clearly a large market for longer form documentaries on streaming and more Kardashian-related programming than anyone could ask for? God, I sound like a snob, but you know what, it's a legitimate question. My best guess as to why that is that the viewing landscape in the current streaming era simply makes the idea of multi-part story viewing much more appealing. It's tempting to watch a series about Michael Jordan or Kanye or Joe Exotic that promises to keep your mind busy for several days or even weeks at a time, all the while being presented in small enough chunks that the runtime doesn't feel too daunting at any given spot. Think about it. If you're a basketball fan, what sounds more appealing to you? Watching a 50-minute episode of The Last Dance, knowing full well that you could stop watching after that short period and pick it up again tomorrow while still experiencing a full episode's arc? Or watching all 3 hours of Hoop Dreams with no obvious indication as to where, or even if, it could be broken up into multiple sittings while retaining that full experience. Simply put, in this era of the internet and binge watching, attention spans have changed. Some would argue for the worse, and I'm not sure who would argue for the better, but I'm sure the defenders are out there. When filtered through that lens, it makes sense that a multi-hour docuseries presented in bite-sized pieces would somehow feel less daunting than a single documentary that runs over the course of maybe 2 of those episodes, with no clear breakup in that runtime. While I personally don't really find the time to dive into docuseries or series of any kind really, I can totally respect the idea of weaving a heavy, nuanced story over a massive runtime that it needs to be told properly. Are there docuseries and miniseries out there that needlessly pad out their lengths? Absolutely, but I doubt you could cover every interesting facet of the OJ trial or, the whole freaking animal kingdom in just 2 hours. So now that we've established the potential appeal of docuseries over briefer documentary films, I want to take a chance to advocate for what a shorter documentary could accomplish, and why it should be beneficial for more people to be open to seeking them out. For starters, to put it plainly, there's a documentary out there to satisfy every interest. You like soul music? Questlove's got you covered. You want to learn about F1 racing? You could watch Senna. Politics, war, orcas, healthcare, filmmaking, honey, salt mining, skateboarding, fatherhood, prison, penguins, Satanism, tourism, grizzly bears, memes? Everything! No matter how niche your interests are, you could find at least one documentary that you could pop in and enjoy in half the time it takes you to watch a season of whatever you're watching on Disney+. Unless what you're watching on Disney Plus is Summer of Soul, which is one of the only reasons I would encourage anyone to burn their money in the mouse pit. So what about the argument that a documentary can only appeal to me if I already care about its subject matter? There are genuinely people out there who think this way, and for them, I doubt a viewing of Won't You Be My Neighbor will shatter their worldview. But I think that most people tend to overestimate their own pickiness in that regard. After all, how many people went into Tiger King with an established interest in illegal big cat ownership? The answer? Not that many, and yet most of us stuck it through all the way to the end. Even if you have no pre-established interest in Mr. Rogers or volcanoes or art forgery, a good documentary has the power to make you care about those things, even if only for the time you're watching it. There's also this argument that the documentary format itself is really boring to watch, and I don't want to watch archival footage with talking heads every time. But while the talking heads format of documentaries has pretty much become the default setting, it's by no means the only way that filmmakers go about presenting their non-fictional subjects. Some documentaries, like Primary or Collective, take on the cinéma vérité approach, where the filmmaker kind of fades into the background and allows the action on screen to unfold as if you are watching a more traditional narrative. Then you've got people like Werner Herzog or Michael Moore, who make a point out of incorporating themselves into the action, letting their eccentric personalities be your guide. Some documentaries, like Tower or Waltz with Bashir, even switch up the visual medium entirely and use animation to both liven up their narratives and punctuate their themes. And yeah, some documentaries do use the talking heads format, but you know what? It's common because it works, and when you have an insightful or impassioned presence in front of the camera, a talking head can be all you really need. Oh well, sure, a documentary could be intellectually interesting, but I watch movies to feel things. How is someone giving me a glorified PowerPoint presentation supposed to do that? To that I say, if you have a hard time getting invested in the story of a real person or event, well...
I missed the part where that's my problem.
At that point, I'd recommend watching Dear Zachary or The Look of Silence a few times until your heart grows 2 sizes. If not, then you may be a sociopath, and I'm sure Disney or Tesla have an opening on their board of directors. At this point, I've hopefully managed to convince some of you to give the documentary film a fair shake, but with so many options out there, where does one start? Don't worry dog, I've got you! Here is a list of 10 documentaries of all sorts that give you a nice, varied taste of what the medium has to offer. Ranking these films would be hell, so these are all listed alphabetically. The Act of Killing and its companion piece The Look of Silence take a pretty harrowing look at the participants and victims of the Indonesian mass killings of the mid-60s. While I actually might prefer The Look of Silence, as the movie from the side of the victims' families is just so heartbreaking to watch, I think the angle that The Act of Killing takes is a bit more interesting. Here, Joshua Oppenheimer follows the actual gangsters who committed these atrocities, and gets pretty intimate with their states of mind, showing that they really have no remorse for the horrible crimes they committed. A tough watch for sure, and maybe not the best one for me to recommend to you right off the bat, but you won't come out of The Act of Killing feeling nothing, I can guarantee you that. Oh boy, another fun one. With the topic of mass shootings being a constant point of contention in American politics, Michael Moore, in 2002, dove into the Columbine shooting of 1999 to examine gun laws and some of the circumstances that might have led to such a crime being able to take place at all. If you know anything about documentaries, then you've probably heard Moore's name floating around. He's a pretty outspoken political filmmaker who's always tackling tricky political subjects like American healthcare and labor laws and 9/11. So a film about gun culture is pretty par for the course for Moore. And Bowling for Columbine pretty much gives you a solid idea of what Moore is all about.
Yeah, I'm here to open up an account.
Okay, what type of account would you like?
I want the account where I can get the free gun.
Okay.
If you're politically conservative, you may want to skip out on this one, but for everyone else, this is a pretty powerful film where subtlety being thrown out the window is very much a good thing.
Right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Alright, now we can have a little fun. Abbas Kiarostami was an Iranian filmmaker who didn't really make documentaries, but whose films had this incredible naturalistic power to them. In fact, to this day, 32 years after Close-Up's release, there's still a debate going about whether or not the film even is a documentary. The story follows a man who impersonated a famous Iranian director, Mohsen Makhmalbaf, in order to trick a family into thinking they would star in his new film. Sound weird and meta? Yeah, that kind of explains the film's dubious classification now, doesn't it? Kiarostami was never one to be incredibly rigid with film form, so Close-Up may sound like a daunting film for anyone who isn't studying film, but it's a pretty straightforward narrative that studies such an odd case, looking into why someone would even go about performing such a con. If you're up to the task and don't mind subtitles, which you shouldn't, then Close-Up is absolutely worth checking out.
خب الان فکر نمی‌کنی به عنوان یه بازیگر جلوی دوربین نشستی؟
Fired by a flea.
There are a few animated documentaries I could have gone for with this list, and I already mentioned 2 great ones. But for now, I'm going to let recency bias take over and suggest Flea. Jonas Poher Rasmussen uses the animated medium to examine a friend of his named Amin, who fled from Afghanistan when his family was separated and made his way to Denmark. The film's use of animation works in a few ways. One, it allows for investing recreations of his struggles without coming off like a reenactment done in poor taste. More importantly, it allows Amin, who is using a pseudonym, to remain anonymous while still giving us a face to connect with. Recently, you may have heard of the acclaim Flea has gotten, becoming the first movie to ever be Oscar nominated for Best Documentary, International Feature, and Animated Film. And really, it should have won 2 of those, if not 1.
And the Oscar goes to...
Encanto! Fuck you too!
Just know that the hype for this touching story was well deserved, and you should see why for yourself.
I decided to move to Orlando to be closer to Disney World.
Oh, Werner Herzog, you are the most interesting person on this planet, and I would sell my soul and my signed copy of Big Crit's best album just to have a 30-minute conversation with you.
It's very easy to hypnotize a chicken.
I feel like I may be overselling Herzog's appeal.
Wrong.
But the man is just such an entertaining, enigmatic filmmaker with an endlessly fascinating career in both documentary and fictional film. It makes sense then that his most famous, and possibly his best, documentary is Grizzly Man, the story of amateur bear conservationist and all-around eccentric Timothy Treadwell, who spent much of his time living around and documenting his time with grizzly bears. Herzog really thrives in telling these man versus nature stories, and what makes Grizzly Man such an interesting one is the way in which Herzog frames it. This was very much a man versus nature story, even if Treadwell saw it differently, and it's intriguing to see Herzog examine that through someone who feels like a sort of kindred spirit to the filmmaker. If you only watch one film from this list, Grizzly Man might be the choice for you. While Close Up was a film about the making of itself, Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Apocalypse, is a film about the making of another film. While I personally find the former approach to be more fulfilling, Hearts of Darkness has also established a legacy as one of the most thrilling making-of stories ever put to celluloid. It's well documented that Francis Ford Coppola's production of Apocalypse Now was an absolute nightmare, and Coppola's own wife Eleanor, along with Fax Barr and George Hickenlooper, translate that chaos with such vividity. Documentarians, in a lot of ways, are like philosophers, asking a lot of
Why?
Hearts of Darkness rolls heavily with that inquisitive attitude, asking not only why the making of this film was so hellish, but why Coppola decided to push through and finish the job.
It became personal with me.
In the same way that you don't have to care about basketball to appreciate a good basketball drama, you don't have to care about the sport to invest yourself in such a textured documentary like Hoop Dreams. Steve James follows two Chicago students, William Gates and Arthur Agee, as they navigate through their lives in the ultimate ambition of joining the NBA. Clocking in at just under 3 hours, this is by far the most demanding documentary here, but none of that time feels wasted, tracking the dedication of these two boys as their circumstances shift continuously, creating one of the most engrossing and empathetic documentaries out there. Roger Ebert called Hoop Dreams the best movie of the 1990s. Not best documentary, best movie, full stop. That's right, better than Pulp Fiction, better than Goodfellas, better than Wild Wild West. What greater endorsement could you possibly want?
Are you gonna put me smoking weed?
Bing Liu's Minding the Gap is a story about three friends, including Liu himself, living in Rockford, Illinois, who got together through their passion of skateboarding, which partially acts as a means to cope with their abusive households. As Liu chronicles their friendship, circumstances change. One boy is subject to blatant racism, another has a kid, and through it all, the strength of their bond is constantly being tested. There's something incredibly raw about Minding the Gap, both in its subject matter and in its honest approach from within the circle it's documenting. Liu pulls no punches in portraying some of the uglier aspects of his friends' lives, but at the end of the day, the connection between these boys thrust into the harshness of adulthood is so palpable that it begins to reach out to you as well.
Hi everybody, this is Peter Jackson.
After the Hobbit films, Peter Jackson seemed to have worn himself down to such a degree that it made perfect sense when he announced he was working on a smaller-scale World War I documentary called They Shall Not Grow Old. But this is Peter Jackson we're talking about, so even when simply cobbling together a documentary from archival footage, he went all out with the technology at his disposal. Pairing recorded testimonials from veterans with corresponding footage from the front lines of the war, Jackson decided to increase the immersive experience by colorizing the footage and adding sound. If that's not enough, if you caught They Shall Not Grow Old during its 2-night theatrical run, it was also presented in 3D. I was there, and more than just a gimmick, Jackson's technical tinkering really helps immerse you in the period with footage that no one could possibly have imagined being used to such an effect. Beyond the technology, these testimonials are just so vivid and telling, but man, it's hard to get over what they did with the footage. I'd also highly recommend the making of featurette, in which Jackson explains the unbelievable lengths to which he and his crew modernized this footage. From slowing down the frame rate to recording every individual sound to using region-specific lip-reading experts, god damn.
Our sound department went to work doing that, and that involved many different aspects. They had to do Foley, which is providing footsteps in the mud, shovels in the ground, working the rifles. Everything that they see in a particular shot, every tiny nuance that would possibly make a sound, they have to actually produce the sound.
It was clearly a massive undertaking, so the least you can do is give it a watch. Hey, wait a second, you said this was alphabetical and S comes before T. What the hell, film seeker, didn't you pass kindergarten? Well, yes, since you asked. I made it all the way to grade 7. But in all honesty, Stop Making Sense is such a juggernaut of a documentary that I just had to break my own rule and put it at the end. If you don't want any talking heads in your documentary, then might I interest you instead in the talking heads? Here we have Jonathan Demme, yes, that Jonathan Demme, filming a concert by David Byrne and his eccentric band over 3 nights in 1983. This movie single-handedly made me a fan of the talking heads. There's just so much electric atmosphere to every second of this film that it makes it almost unfathomable that any of this managed to be captured on film. It's wild, it's unpredictable, and holy shit, the music slaps. David Byrne is such a mad genius, but Stop Making Sense also works as a showcase for the other members of the band, particularly in a case like this where everyone is truly performing with every fiber of their physical being. I'm honestly left speechless every time I see it. Now there's some dispute about whether or not concert films should qualify as documentaries, but in my view, they're documenting an actual event, so for all intents and purposes,
I'll allow it.
I meant what I said when I said that Grizzly Man is probably my best documentary recommendation, but Stop Making Sense is certainly my easiest recommendation. Gather some friends, crack open a few cold ones, and let the experience just wash over you. So there you have my take on documentary films. With any luck, I've led some of you on the right path, and for others who are already on the doc wavelength, maybe I've helped you reminisce a bit. At the end of the day, I hope your main takeaway here is that the next time someone says they want to watch a real movie instead of a documentary, then it might be time for you to take a lesson you've learned from one of these films today and just flee. Or feed that friend to a grizzly, you've got some leeway here.